Today, I want to talk about a very sensitive topic, love, and even more specifically, unconditional love. What is unconditional love, and where does it come from specifically? But the most important question of all I have is unconditional love something that comes up naturally, or is it a decision that we make to love someone or something unconditionally? I am a firm believer that one of, if not the most important emotion a human being feels is love. Probably that is the top on my list. But before I dig into the actual topic of love and unconditional love, I think that we need to try to understand its origins. Like, how do we learn to love and where does it come from exactly? Think about it. The moment we're born, we have no clue of what emotions are. We experience them through our childhood, and that's when we can classify them as such. But we are born with no idea of what love is, nor any other emotion in that matter. So if you think about it, love is probably the only emotion that we experience for the first time on the receiving end of it. Let me explain. We receive love from someone, and only through receiving that care, that attention, that feeling, that then we classify it as love, but we receive it first to understand how it feels. Unlike other emotions, I believe, like, sadness or anger, these are all a product of something that's happening to us and that we might process in a different way. Love is the only one that we receive without knowing how it feels until we actually receive it. As toddlers, babies, we have this immediate connection with the person or the parents, whoever's taking care of us, right? And it is up to these people to then give us the care, the love, the attention. And it is through that then we recognize it as that emotion equals love. But again, other feelings like anger, sadness, fear, these are all emotions that are triggered by a situation. And that we, as children, but even as adults, can process in different ways. For example, I was afraid of dogs, but no one told me to be afraid of dogs. No one gave me the fear of dogs, right? Whereas in love, I received love, and that's how I recognized that love was a thing. Or you get put in timeout when you're like really young and pre-K or whatever, kindergarten. And some children I remember, they just were really like chill. They didn't care. I was like crying my balls out because it just felt so irritating. So again, this is another type of feeling that really depends on the person, on how to process it and how to live it. But love is something that we receive and that we kind of try to mimic the way we receive it. It's almost like an echo of someone else's voice because it's love. We like that feeling and we do everything in our power to mimic those beautiful moments. It's normal. This is why I think that the way then we tend to express our love to other people, later in life, probably not as toddlers, but as teens, as adults, young adults, older adults, elderly people, I think that the way we actually give love, the way we express love, depends still on the way we received it when we were younger. So it's nothing more than a reflection of the way you were treated and you were loved when you were younger. Certainly, we do put some of our personality into it, but the intuitive part of us still is connected to that idea of saying, I am going to show love to this person the way I was taught to love. So that's why I think it's very, very critical, especially when you're extremely young, on the way you receive that love. Because there are some people who don't receive love and who are just not able to then be emotionally invested into a relationship in the future, any type of relationship. A friendship, it can be something more than a friendship, hell, a situationship if you want to. But it really depends on how you're treated from before. Because on the other hand, if you're treated really well and your parents treat you with respect, with love, with care, then you will try to do the same thing with the person that you want to treat well, with respect and care. And I think that can sum the idea of where love comes from. So yeah, first point. It's an emotion that we receive. It's probably the only, if not one of the very few emotions that we receive, that we're at the receiving end, and then we try to replicate very precisely. So this brings me to my actual question, the hot topic, unconditional love. Do we decide to love unconditionally? We know that love, the feeling of love, can occur to anyone, especially after that imprinting moment where you receive it from your loved ones. But do we love unconditionally the same way as we receive love the first time? Or better, is unconditional love something that comes up naturally, or is it a firm decision? So I have a couple of scenarios. Some of them are real, some of them are not real, just to make sure no one thinks I'm crazy. The real one, I'm going to start with the real one. For example, I was adopted at a very young age. And for the longest time, I thought that love was something that had to do with the ideal of leaving your son, your biological son in that case. And it took me some time to get over that. But then my second question occurred, and that is, do my parents, my now parents, love me unconditionally by choice or by nature? And the immediate answer that comes to my head, no shade, but the immediate answer that comes to my head is no. They chose to love me unconditionally because out of a number of orphans, they chose me. They were open to the idea of letting a new person come into their family and loving them as if he or she, in my case me, he was like blood related. But let's go to a different scenario. Let's say you're in a relationship and you get cheated on. So at what point are you able to love unconditionally? Because loving someone unconditionally means loving that person no matter what. No matter what, you stick to that plan. Are you willing to stick to that plan if your partner decides to cheat on you? Or even worse, you find yourself in a horrible, toxic relationship, even abusive. Now, most of the times in that case, the answer people would give me is, no, well, there is a limit to it. So you do have conditions, rightfully so, don't get me wrong. But at that point, is unconditional love spontaneous, or is it a decision? And even furthermore, are you actually loving this person unconditionally or based on conditions? Third scenario that comes to mind is, again, having a child. Let's say you have a child, you adopt or you have it, up to you, and you love this child. Let's say you love this child unconditionally, like from within. It's obviously like not a decision in that case. And this child grows up to be a horrible person, like the most hated criminal on earth. Would you still love that child? Would you still love that person that has become such a terrible person? Would you still be able to love them for who they are? And in my case, I would probably say no. Like, if my son or my daughter or my child in general would like become a horrible person, I would probably disown them. I would probably not accept the horrible things they do. So at what point do we know that we can or can't love unconditionally? Or better, when do we decide that unconditional love does apply, and when do we understand that it doesn't apply? So my conclusion to unconditional love, even though if it might be very confusing, is no, unconditional love is not something natural. It is a decision. a very important decision in that matter, because you can't love somebody unconditionally with conditions. And I believe that it is not something to be guilty of. Like, we all have conditions, we all have values that we want the people around us to respect, just like we are expected to respect other people's values. And I think that that is what makes relationships, whether they be family relationships, love relationships, friendship relationships, these all enter into one big sphere, and that is respecting one another. And respecting one another means understanding each other's values and not crossing the line. Now, if you cross that line, the other party, the other person might take a step back, and that's normal. That is valid, but it is not unconditional love. You can't say you love someone unconditionally if the moment they fuck up and they do something extremely wrong, you are going to back off. Don't get me wrong. I'd rather say that I love someone with conditions, with values that I expect to be respected, rather than saying I love that person unconditionally. Therefore, whatever they do, the moment I get taken advantage of or I find myself in a toxic relationship, I still have to stick with the plan, because from the very start, I believe in this idealism of unconditional love. So no, unconditional love is not something natural. It comes from a very important decision, which might mature in time and might change. But just like we're able to find a limit over which we're not able to love someone unconditionally, there has to also be a criteria over which we decide to love unconditionally. I just believe that that criteria can't be executed on somebody else, on someone who is not us. And this brings me to the next part of this episode, which is I do believe unconditional love can exist, but we can't execute it, if you will, on somebody else. Let me explain. Unconditional love is really difficult to have with somebody else. Again, because there is a criteria, there are values over which we at least should be able to back off the moment this line is crossed. But with ourselves, that's a different story. I think that the unconditional type of love can be executed, but with ourselves. Self-love. Now, practicing self-love is a very difficult thing. And the reason is our imprinting wasn't very clear. As I said before, we receive love and we like that as toddlers, right? We try to mimic that, but we're never taught to teach ourselves to actually love ourselves from within, at least not my generation. The moment you realize that you're not able to love yourself, you also realize that you're not able to love somebody else. Now, does that mean that you can't be in a relationship until you're completely in love with yourself? No. Does that mean you can't have children in the future because you're completely not at peace with your mind? No. But that means that we have a chance to actually learn from ourselves and also understand the reason why most of the people of my age aren't able to realize on time that they need to learn to love themselves first. There's this very, very famous saying, which we all heard at a certain point in our lives, which goes along the lines of, you can't love somebody until you can't love yourself. And I believe in that. The fact that we haven't been taught from a very young age to love ourselves just like we're able to love someone does become an actual challenge the moment you grow up or even go to college or get a job and move out of your house. That is a real problem because most of us are then in this constant search of approval. Me included. I was like that for an extremely long time. But giving love to someone doesn't necessarily mean we will receive it back, hence the heartbreak, until the worst of the worst happens. Usually, we realize that we need to do some self-love work after a very bad or very toxic situation, unfortunately. Like, you need to crash before you actually understand that you have to pull the brakes. Not everybody actually ends up like that, but most of us do. I was just moving out from my house in Italy, and I just moved into my new apartment in America, and I was completely alone. And I stumbled across this person with whom I eventually had a situationship, and apparently I was cool with that. I couldn't be more wrong. The fact that I was thinking and I was convinced that I had everything under control clearly demonstrated that I had nothing under control. Like, the moment you think you have everything under control, the shit hits the fan. Back then, you're naive. You don't understand anything. Well, you do understand, but you don't have experience, and you just go with the flow. Little did I know that would have a terrible backlash on me, and it would take me months, if not years, to actually try to recuperate from that. Because this person I was having a situationship with made it very clear from the very beginning that they were not looking for a relationship. And I was convinced I was okay with that, whereas I truly wasn't. The reason why I still kept on going, despite knowing I was in a bad situation, was because I so desperately needed that approval. I so desperately needed to see some love coming back, because I constantly gave it. But the problem was, I didn't receive the same amount I gave. And that drained me very, very quickly, to a point where I had to back off, but I was completely drained at that point. And this person made it very clear from the beginning that they weren't looking for a relationship, and they were actually talking to a gazillion other people. And I was aware of that. I was being told that by this very person. So at what point do you realize that you have to back off? At what point do you understand that what you are doing is wrong? Well, unfortunately, you realize that when it's too late. Back then, I lost a lot of weight. I was constantly doubting myself. And, I gave this person my time, my attention, my house, and I kind of lost 6 months in which I could have actually have been doing something completely different, like actually going to classes instead of like staying home with this person. But the point is, as much as some people might throw shade on this type of person or this type of personality, which to some degree we might end up calling it as a toxic personality, it is up to us to understand when something is good and when something is not good for us. We can't have somebody else constantly come up to us and say, don't take this path because it's not going to be okay for you. We don't have that luxury anymore, especially once you're an adult. If there is one thing that I've learned in life so far, is that life will throw you a lot of opportunities and situations, and it is up to you to actually decide whether to take those or not, depending on the case, depending on the point in life that you find yourself at. Because if you take everything life throws at you and you try to digest every single bit of it, you're going to end up extremely full, and eventually you're going to have indigestion. And as much as that is an extremely bad example, Jesus Christ, but it actually gives the idea. Like, if you always try to take in everything reality gives you, you're going to end up with an actual stomach ache or a headache, because you are going to be overwhelmed. And as much as people don't like the term overwhelmed because it makes us feel like we are in some way not as strong as we would want to be, that means we have some growing up to do, because asking for help isn't something wrong. Going back to the situationship thing, you learn from your past and from your mistakes. So hopefully you're not going to repeat that. But it's completely up to us to understand whether what is given to us, what is brought to us is something that's actually good for us at the moment. And back then, it was not a good moment. It was not a good time for me to be in a situationship, even though I actively decided to be in one. So again, it's not this person's fault because this person was being extremely honest. I was very good at hiding my emotions. I'm extremely good at hiding my emotions. I made this person believe that it was okay to do that because I felt like I was strong enough, whereas I completely knew I was not strong enough for that. But regardless of when a person realizes that they need to do some self-work, some self-love, I think that the hard part isn't trying to realize it, because if we are honest enough with ourselves, I think that anyone is able to get to a point where they're like, no, I need to do some self-work. But the hard part comes when you're like, okay, I realized it, but where do I go on from here? Because sometimes we don't actually know ourselves as good as we actually think we know ourselves. The world stops. And usually what happens is you either go up or you go down. 99% of the time, you go down. Usually go into depression, you stop eating, you stop hanging out with your friends, because the only thing that you thought was the right thing in that moment in your life is gone. But it's a good thing, even though it seems like a bad thing. My advice from what I actually experienced is try to treat yourself as if you were your own kid. Like, imagine if a random person just ran to you at a park and said, take care of my kid for 6 months. Thank you very much. See you later. And they just ran away. Like, what would you do with that kid? Like, what would a sane person do? Someone would say, call the cops. True. But let's say that wasn't an option. Like, you have this kid and you have to take care of this kid for like 6 months, at least 6 months to a year, let's say. You would make sure they eat healthy. You would make sure they have their priorities set right, like schoolwork, friendships. You would make sure they go out and run, do some sports. You would make sure they're safe. As much as these things might seem so normal, so usual, they actually are extremely important for any child's upbringing. Because if a child doesn't have these little things in his life, or her life, or their life, it just won't grow the right way. Like, they need to have some sort of rhythm in their lives, you know? Whatever type of that rhythm is. It doesn't have to be what I said. It could be anything. They could be homeschooled. They could not go to school. They could be vaccinated, not vaccinated. I don't care. I'm just saying that having a rhythm in your life might help. So treat yourself as if you were that kid. Take yourself to the gym. Make sure you eat healthy food. Make sure you eat periodically. Make sure you don't forget to eat. Sleep well. Like, get yourself a good sleep schedule. And believe it or not, taking care of yourself in this way will actually spark something in you. And that is something that, like, you can't believe it until you actually experience it. All of the people I've spoken with, and I told them this, are like, either you're high or, you're hallucinating, or you're just like bullshitting your way. Trust me. Like, the moment your subconscious self sees that you're treating yourself the good way, the right way, you will start waking up in the morning, going to the mirror, and actually liking what you see. And I'm not talking about shape. I'm not talking about, being in shape, maybe going to the gym or eating healthy, having a better skin. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that you will recognize the person that you see in the mirror. And we have gotten used so much. I don't know about you guys, but I have gotten so much used to not recognizing myself. I was completely lost. So these very few steps actually made me realize that, taking care of myself, having a sleep schedule, eating healthy, actually made me feel like I was cared for. And for the first time, I wasn't actually being cared for from someone, but I was being cared from myself. It's like a relationship with yourself. And the moment you give love, you actually receive it back from yourself. And that's where the unconditional type of love kicks in, I believe. It is only by having a clear idea of your own values, of your own life rhythm, that you're then able to say, I'm able to love myself unconditionally because there's no one else in the world that will follow my life, my path, my rhythm in the way I do. And that's why I also believe in the saying that you are your best friend. If you want to actually have prolific relationships, if you actually want to have a good, a good mental health, if you want also to spread a good vibe to people, just spreading the vibe, it's through being comfortable with yourself. I'm not saying I got there, because this is something that never ends, but you will see there is a really big improvement. But you got to give yourself that 6 months, you got to give yourself that year to recover, to learn from yourself. And that's where I think the real unconditional love comes from. Learning how to love yourself, and therefore learning how to love other people. And again, unconditional love, despite the fact that it comes from within, actually is a decision also, because you have to actively decide that you are going to take care of yourself for these 6 months, for this entire year, before it actually becomes something that you don't even have to think of. And I think that the only success a person can have with unconditional love is with themselves. And as selfish that might seem, I think it is one of the most beautiful realizations that a person can have in their life. Because, I repeat, the moment you unconditionally love yourself, the moment you have an unconditional relationship with yourself, you're able to take care of yourself no matter what. You're able to love yourself no matter what. You're able to give so much more to the people that you actually care for. So yeah, this is unconditional love.